Hey everyone, welcome to D Squared Stories, an audio fiction podcast that brings you short, serialized weekly stories. Our second story of this podcast is called Amoretta. It's the story of a small town of Amoretta under the thumb of a big corporation called Phosphon Corp. That's bleeding the town and the mines dry. However, Amoretta is no normal town. When a mysterious stranger arrives at the heart of the town, the Old Horseshoe Saloon, the town's trajectory is changed forever. His mysterious past, the dark and magical history of the town, and the bloodthirsty desire of corporate greed will all clash as secrets are revealed and lives are changed forever. This will be a 5-part series, with new chapters dropping every Monday, so be sure to subscribe on your podcast app of choice to get updates on the new chapters as they come out. And before we start, if you like what you listened to today, please let me know by dropping a like, rating the podcast, or leaving a comment. It really goes a long way, and it lets me know what types of stories you might want to see in the future. I'd love to hear what you think. If you know someone who might like this story, please share it with them. Without further ado, let's get started on Chapter 1 of Amoretta. Chapter 1. A stranger comes to town. The Old Horseshoe Saloon was the liveliest spot in all of Amoretta. The creaky floors and the authentic saloon doors, having been there since its inception in the early 20s, made it feel like a true outlaw's paradise. That being said, the bar was quite mellow, the regulars being mostly miners coming in after a long day's shift with their loved ones. Wallace, the owner, often wore a button-down shirt and a suit jacket as he worked the bar. "Formality is the best reality," he said to a patron as he poured them another light beer. "Oh, Wallace, you're always so chipper," the miner said. The miner went back to his fellow workers at their table. They sat on the old falling-apart chairs, laughing and sharing stories. The tables, drab and brown, were worn down from years of use. Wallace's bar was in a little better condition. He put in the effort to have it refinished every odd few years. Jasmine Johnson, a young 20-year-old barback with frizzy brown hair, grabbed the empty glass and added it to her tray. She caught someone giving her eyes from her periphery, and she rolled her eyes in response. Everyone seemed to pause and become more alert as she came by and picked up their dishes. Jasmine seemed to pay them no mind, as she grabbed each drink and plate. The older, worn-down wares were beaten up and old, and yet were still somehow a little more in shape than the more recently bought items. She brought them back to the sink, just out of sight from the bar. Wallace smiled at her as she passed. "I appreciate you putting in some extra time," Wallace said. "You know what I say, an extra hour's a little extra power." "'Cause extra cash is what it is, Wallace," Jasmine said. He laughed at this. With all his orders addressed, he stepped out from behind the bar and walked over to a high-top table, where a man sat alone, staring pensively at his beer. "Hey, Arnold, mind if I pop a squat?" he asked. "It's not right for a man to drink by himself, even if the stuff is top shelf." Arnold looked up at him, a long look of sadness in his face. He adjusted in his chair, and there was a wince of pain that stretched across his expression. "I don't know what I'm going to do, Wallace," he said. "My girl, Colleen, she's not doing much better." "The treatments for the lung disease ain't helping?" Wallace asked. "Not enough. I can barely afford them with my wages. Phosphon axed her health insurance. Now the medicine she needs she can't get. I've been trying to work extra shifts to try and buy it all myself, but it's so expensive." Arnold's eyes widened a bit. "Extra shifts?" he asked. "But your back's no good as it is, Arnold. You need to be careful. You don't want your girl to grow up without a father. Anyone knows that would be more than just a bother." "Wrong," he said. "I want my girl to grow up, no matter what the cost." There was a silence in the air as he said this. The groups nearby had stopped talking, blowing their cover of secretly eavesdropping on the conversation. Arnold took a swig of his drink, not having meant to air his family's woes to the entire saloon. A miner at the nearest table raised a glass to everyone else. "Screw Phosphon!" he yelled. "Screw Phosphon!" the saloon cheered in response. "I'll drink to that," Jasmine said, pouring herself a beer. "Ain't you still working?" Wallace asked. "Only 15 minutes left," she said, taking big gulps of the beer. In that moment, the Old Horseshoe Saloon doors swung open. A tall man in a cowboy hat entered, his boots causing the floorboards to creak as he stepped into the establishment. All eyes turned to him. He looked rather old, the hair on his head short, but his brown beard was long and scruffy. His blue eyes seemed to pop right off his face as he scanned the room. Wallace quickly made his way back behind the bar. Jasmine stared on in curiosity as the man stood there. Whispers filled the room quickly. "Is this another Phosphon gun for hire?" one asked. "Who is this outsider? I've never seen him," another said. The stranger strutted towards the bar. His hips seemed to sway with each step, drawing everyone's attention to the revolver at his waist. The flowy leather jacket he wore seemed to sway as if blown by the breeze. He got up to the bar and looked Wallace dead in the eye. "1 iced tea, and your soup of the day, please," he said. Wallace started to tilt his head in confusion as he caught himself. Yes, sirree," he said. "Jazz, can you get the man an iced tea? An iced tea is a nice tea, after all." The stranger smiled. "I like that." Wallace smiled back. "And the soup of the day is a chicken chili chowder. Is that all right?" The man's face went stone cold. Wallace could almost feel himself sweating a bit as this intense figure stared him down. The miners at the one table looked on in apprehension. The stranger leaned in close to Wallace. "How spicy is it?" he asked. "I'm not very good with spicy food." Wallace let out a sigh of relief. "It's not very spicy. Just a little kick to it. Won't be dicey," he said. The stranger nodded, confirming his order. Jasmine handed him his iced tea. He went to sit alone at a high-top table in the corner of the room. Wallace wiped his brow. He turned towards Jasmine as he wrote down the order and hung it on the door for the kitchen. "Well, that was oddly intense," he said. Jasmine nodded, unable to take her eyes off the stranger. There was a bit of commotion at the miners' table. Everyone seemed to be suddenly scrambling and looking on the floor. "I can't seem to find it anywhere," one said. A man looked over at Jasmine. "I bet she swiped your phone when she came over to get our glasses," the other said. Jasmine's nostrils flared in a bit of rage as she walked over to the table. "What was that?" she asked angrily. "You heard me," the man said. The miner looking for his phone suddenly pulled it from a concealed jacket pocket. "Never mind, here it is," he said. Jasmine and her accuser still stared daggers at one another. Wallace quickly ran over to try to break up the confrontation. Now, he said. "Jazz, why don't you just take off early from your shift?" She stared up at him, a bit annoyed. Nonetheless, she left the man and went back to her half-drunk pint. She downed it and then completely refilled it again. Wallace looked on with a hint of disapproval, but said nothing. She walked over to the corner of the saloon where the stranger sat. He had not even raised his eyes from the local paper to watch the conflict. "I'll be sitting over here, chatting up the only other outsider in this whole damn town," she said. The man continued to examine the paper closely, not even bringing his eyes up to her. "So, partner, what's your name?" she asked. He took a sip of his iced tea, not even looking at her. "I don't really have one." Jasmine looked confused. "You don't have one? I reckon everyone has a name." "Not me. Not anymore, at least," he said. "I suppose you can call me Ghost if you want." "Ghost? What a peculiar name," she said. She leaned in, putting her elbows on the table and stretching so that her face was just above his newspaper, and she could look at his eyes. Despite this, he still seemed intent on paging through the paper. "You're not interested in talking to me, stranger?" she asked. Ghost put down his paper and looked at her. His bright blue eyes had a sort of intensity about them. No matter what he looked at, he seemed to be giving it 100% of his attention. His soup arrived, and Jasmine's brief smile turned into a pout as she realized she had not successfully gotten his attention. "I'm interested in talking," he said. "What you want to talk about?" He started eating his soup. The saloon was mostly quiet as everyone's attention seemed to be drawn into watching this conversation play out. The miners, for the most part, minus Arnold, seemed to watch with slight animosity as the two chatted. Wallace, for his part, just seemed nervous about the mysterious figure. "Well, Ghost, what brings a handsome man like you to Amoretta?" she asked, batting her eyes. Ghost blew on his soup before eating more of it. "Been looking for something. It's not of great importance to anyone else, but I think the only spot I'll find it is here." "How cryptic. I love a man of mystery," she said. "Say, Ghost, did you know we have real spirits here in Amoretta?" "Don't go running your mouth, girl," a miner said. She glared at his table. "I reckon so," he said. She got distracted from her staring match and looked at him in wonder. "You did?" she asked. "I reckon that's the only way something like that could ever happen," he said. He gestured towards his glass of iced tea. It was now floating, hovering haphazardly above his soup. Jasmine jumped back in her chair. The other miners stared on in awe. Wallace just chuckled a bit to himself. "That looks like a playful one," Wallace said. "They're really kind of outsiders. I always say they let 'em alone or make 'em go home." Ghost smiled. "This one must like me, or at least my iced tea." Jasmine reached out towards the spirit with a finger. She seemed to lightly tickle underneath the glass. The iced tea slowly made its way to the table as she continued wiggling her finger. "They are friendly to me, too," she said. "A little too friendly. Bring me gifts that ain't theirs to bring." "Likely story," a miner said. Jasmine ignored him. "They're the only reason this town is still afloat." Ghost seemed interested in this. "And how's that?" If Phosphon had their way, they'd use their fancy mining machines to dig up all the Amoretta ore. Little tricksters always bust 'em up, though. They also harass any outsiders they try to bring in and contract the work out to. They have to hire us to dig it up, and that's what's up. Amoretta ore? Ghost asked. Special type of semiconductor, found only in the Amoretta mines, Wallace said. Some say the spirits made it themselves as a way of keeping this town alive. It's unnatural, unlike any other element. Like a rare polka-dotted elephant. And I reckon that's why Phosphon is so desperate to get their hands on it, Ghost said. Damn right, Jasmine said. And that coward Ray Fever won't rest until the mine is dry and all the men are worked to death. Ray Fever. Ghost paused. He looked absolutely stone cold again, as he did when he first entered. He took a sip of his iced tea. Gotta be one of the dumbest names I ever heard. He make it up himself? What's this man's deal? At the same time as Ghost entered the old Horseshoe Saloon, on the other side of town, past the dilapidated local stores and houses, there was a big complex. It was Phosphon's shipping facility. Several workers, a mix of local and foreign contractors, bustled about, trying to get ore loaded up on the trucks. Meanwhile, they unloaded pre-processed food, basic supplies, and all sorts of other things off the trucks. In the center, there was a fenced-in building, a hotel that looked like it had been put up just a day ago. It had a pool, several stories, and was flanked by several armed guards. On the third floor, in a conference room, Ray Fever sat alone, video conferencing with a conference room far away, filled with old men in suits. Fever, your production facility just isn't meeting its projected profit margins, a voice said. Ray sighed. And as I've mentioned, those projections are far too aggressive. They assume somehow I'd be paying each miner lower than the minimum wage. Believe me, I would if I could, but I know from the back injury incident that there's a whistleblower around here. Ray was a rather short and skinny young man. His tan skin was rough, and his stubble seemed to be ever-present, despite his aggressive shaving. In every way, he was unremarkable, except for his eyes. They were a piercing bright blue, though they were overshadowed by an overall lack of confidence in his expression. Ray tapped on his desk nervously as another man answered him. We've looked at your stat sheets, and it seems like many of your employees are picking up extra shifts, he said. We should limit their pay to only 40 hours a week. Ray crinkled his forehead in frustration. There's only so many miners in this town, and I've told you non-locals keep quitting because of the superstition around the spirits. Ah, you misunderstand, the man said. I didn't say to limit their hours, just their pay. If they want to keep their jobs, there should be an expectation of working extra. Ray bit his lip. How am I supposed to? Another thing, a different man said. We're tired of these excuses at the shipping facility of spirits stealing supplies. Root out this thief at once and stop paying lip service to these backwater rumors. Ray turned around and walked towards the window of his building. He looked down until he spotted two contractors chasing after a floating crate as it ran away from them. He looked towards where the security cameras were. As he expected, they somehow had been readjusted to be looking up at the clouds. Do you understand, Fever? The man asked. Yes, he said. I actually am on the verge of making a breakthrough on that front. My walkie-talkie initiative has found some insight on how we can solve our thief situation and maybe even boost the morale of workers. I don't recall worker morale being one of our KPIs, a man said. Right, but the higher their morale, the more they'd be willing to work, Ray said. Fascinating theory. Whatever boosts your numbers, he said. You have until the end of the quarter to resolve this, Fever. If you can't, we'll replace you. We've given you leeway because of your success in former roles, but don't think we'll let you flounder much longer. End of meeting. They cut off the video feed abruptly. Ray put his face in his hands. All the chairs in the conference room suddenly started moving about, the spirits knocking some over, while others just moved them out of the room. Several aides came running to try and chase down the runaway chairs. He pulled out his wallet, and from it pulled out a photo. It was a child version of him and someone who looked like him but about 5 years older. They wore matching baseball caps. He stared at the picture, sighing. I wish you were still alive, brother, he said. You were always the strong and fierce one. And then in the same meeting, the spirit dumped the pot of coffee right on his head, a miner at the old Horseshoe Saloon said, barely holding in his laughter. The entire bar laughed while Ghost continued finishing his soup. Anyway, yeah, so that's Ray Fever, a pathetic little imp of a man, Jasmine said, as she raised her glass. Screw Ray Fever. The others raised their glasses. Screw Ray Fever. Ghost did not participate in the toast. Instead, he finished his soup and rifled through his pocket, pulled out a $20 bill, and placed it on the table. "My tab. Keep the change," he said. He rose up and departed from the saloon, his boots creaking the floorboards with every step he took. Jasmine, in a rush, hurried after him. "Hey, what gives? We were chatting," she said. She ran up to him and grabbed his arm. He turned over his shoulder and looked coldly at her. As he did, Arnold came walking out of the bar, too. He simply nodded his head at Ghost and Jasmine as he kept walking past. "Sorry, I'm not good at goodbyes," Ghost said. "Then don't say goodbye," she said, winking. "Come back to my place for a bit." He stared at her. He leaned in closely. "Ma'am, I reckon I am at least 20 years your senior," he said. "You'd best be dating folks much closer to your own age." "Dating?" she chuckled. "I'm not looking for anything serious, Mr. Ghost. Besides, you saw the folks in there. They don't take too kindly to me. No pearl-clutching mother would dare let someone like me snatch their son and dirty their family bloodline." "Nonetheless, I have somewhere to be," he said. "Fine, have it your way," she said. She let go of his arm and walked off in a huff. Ghost continued down the lonely streets of the forgotten town of Amoretta. He seemed to study the buildings closely as he walked by, as if to take them in more fully. He stopped when he got to a building that looked even more run down than all the others. In a very faded text at the top of the building, it said Amoretta Library. There was caution tape by the door, but Ghost ignored it, pushing his way in. As he entered the library, books seemed to flutter and move about freely, getting out of his way as he approached, dragged by the spirits. Ghost made his way towards the back of the library. There was a handful of old boxes. He rifled through them, newspaper after newspaper. As he did this, the spirits opened up the other boxes and started to pull out old newspapers. Ghost waved his hand at them, trying to dissuade them. As he did this, looking up for the first time, he jumped back. He stared at a girl who was peeking out from behind a bookshelf. "Girl, what are you doing in a place like this?" he asked. She walked forward, staring up at him with immense curiosity. "I was playing with the spirits," she said. "My name's Colleen. What's yours?" As the child's voice introduced herself, suddenly 2 sets of footsteps could be heard running towards the two. It was Arnold and a woman with him. "Kelsey, come look. She's right over here," Arnold said. Arnold and Kelsey ran over to Colleen. Kelsey immediately scooped the young girl up into her arms and pulled her a bit away from the stranger. Arnold looked at him with familiarity. "It's you again," he said. "Sorry, I was looking for my daughter. She ran off while my wife was cooking." "Your daughter ran off to this abandoned library?" Ghost asked. "I like to play with the spirits. Put me down, Mommy," she said. "She's a handful. She likes to come here because the spirits are always milling about in this place. They seem to like it because of all the memories it holds, and how undisturbed it's been." Colleen reached out and seemed to try to grab something from the air. Ghost tilted his head a bit. "You're a girl. She sees the spirits?" he asked. "Yeah, she does," Arnold said. "That's quite impressive," Ghost said, and pointed at a floating box. "Tell me, girl, what do the spirits carrying that box look like?" Her eyes brightened up. "There's 3. One looks like a teapot, the other looks like a toad, the other looks like a candlestick." Arnold frowned. "That's what the old folks who can see them say they look like. Assortments of strange animals and objects." "The old folks can see the spirits too?" Ghost asked. "Yeah, that's Arnold paused. Kelsey put her arm around him. "It's how they know they only got a few months left. You can only see the spirits if you're close to death." Arnold and Kelsey started sobbing, holding each other and Colleen. Colleen seemed completely unfazed by all of this as she continued trying to reach out for the spirits. Ghost watched her carefully as she did this. "What's your girl afflicted with?" he asked. Kelsey stopped sobbing long enough to answer. "It's called desert lung. It's a rare disease, named after the folks who get it normally being in an arid climate. It normally doesn't affect children, but..." Ghost nodded. "Not common, but possible. There is a medicine for it, though, is there not?" Arnold chuckled. "Yeah, but I have no health insurance and it's too damn expensive. No chance we could get our hands on it." "Phosphon is using this town as a waypoint for shipments now, are they not?" he asked. "Surely some medicine must go through it. Next shipment of it, I'll steal for you and your girl." Arnold and Kelsey's jaws dropped. "That's impossible," Arnold said. "All Phosphon shipments are heavily guarded by armed guards. You'd be shot dead." Ghost chuckled. "I'm a bit of a sharpshooter myself. I can handle my own. Just you watch." Suddenly, the boxes and books all immediately dropped to the ground. There was a whirlwind around the 4 people in the library, as if all the spirits were circling around at great speeds to cause a vortex. A look of recognition washed over Arnold's face. "No, Ghost, don't do this. Don't make a promise to me," he said. "The spirits here make promises binding. If you promise me this and you back out, they'll torture you. They'll make you try at any cost, even if given your life." Ghost simply smiled and pointed at Colleen, who seemed to spin her head around trying to watch the spirits as they circled rapidly around them. "I promise you, Kelsey, and your girl," Ghost said. "I promise you I'm going to get that medicine." As he said this, the spirits seemed to scatter in multiple directions. Arnold and Kelsey just stood there in complete awe of this stranger and his incredible promise. Colleen simply clapped her hands in excitement, not understanding the gravity of the situation. Ghost then tipped his hat to say farewell and made his way towards the door. A piece of paper flew right in front of his face. It was a newspaper clipping from about 10 years ago. He looked at it and grabbed it. "Oh, thank you, Conspirit," he said. "I had almost forgotten why I came here." He pocketed the newspaper and continued making his way out of the library. As he stepped out of the library, he heard some yelling nearby. He strode over to see Jasmine. She was being grabbed by her wrist by 2 armed Phosphon guards. A stout man with a mustache and sheriff badge stood alongside them as a few folks from the saloon gathered around. "Unhand me, you filthy goons!" she yelled. Wallace stepped out of the saloon. "Sheriff, what's the meaning of this?" "Phosphon has video evidence of Jasmine stealing from them," he said. "They finally confirmed what we all knew, which was that she was a liar and a thief." A couple of miners in the crowd forming clapped and cheered. "You worthless pieces of—" She was interrupted by a guard yanking her away and finally cuffing her. "I didn't do this. I didn't do any of this," she said. "Stuff it, lady," the guard said, dragging her off. "Excuse me, folks." Ghost strode up into the center of the scuffle. He swiveled his hips to face the guard and sheriff, his revolver on full display. The folks who were gathered looked on in awe as this stranger looked ready to draw on the sheriff and the armed guards. Jasmine stared in shock as he did so. "I'm going to have to ask you to unhand that young woman," he said. "And what if I don't?" the guard said. He spit at Ghost's face, but Ghost yanked his head to the left, dodging it completely. "Then we're going to have a problem," he said. Ghost reached towards his hip. The sheriff and other guard instantly went for their weapons as well. Tensions were high as everyone watched to see how this confrontation would play out. Thank you so much for listening to this chapter of Amoretta. If you enjoyed, please rate the podcast on the app, give it a like on YouTube, and share with anyone who you think might also enjoy. Amoretta is a D Squared Stories production. You can stay up to date with Amoretta and all future D Squared Stories productions by finding us on social media. That'll be D Squared Stories, across just about any of the big platforms. I appreciate you listening and hope to have you listen again next week.